let's get started. Looks like we got a bunch of folks here today. Thanks for joining us to today's webinar. Today's webinar is reporting cybersecurity to the board. And I have two panelists here today, Randy and Lucas, which we'll do some introductions here in a second. Before we jump into that, though, we'll do some housekeeping items. This will be recorded, like I already mentioned, so you can watch it later or share it with your team. We'll also do Q&A. So we do have an agenda that we'll be going through some questions and discussing different aspects of this topic. But if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A or the chat. I'll be monitoring it and we'll be answering them throughout the Q&A. We love questions. So please give us your hardest questions. Randy and Lucas love really hard questions. They told me right before this. So yeah, please share your questions and we'd love to answer them and make us interactive as possible. So awesome. Let's do some introductions. Lucas, would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Taylor. So Lucas Hathaway, the CRO here at Rivial. I've been with Rivial for over 11 years now and working pretty exclusively with banks or credit unions of many different sizes. I have a lot of experience reporting to many boards over the years, reviewing board reports, helping create board reports, and all of that. So excited to kind of dive into this today. I think it's a really important topic. So looking forward to chatting through it.
Lucas, Randy, mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Taylor. Before I introduce myself, though, I will have to say that in addition to the upcoming festive holiday season, it is also Lucas's birthday. So before I gave out that personal information, I did check with him to make sure it was okay. Not that he had much choice, but happy birthday, Lucas.
Thank you.
So yes, so back to my introduction. So Randy Lindbergh, founder and CEO of Rivial. I started the company back in about 2010. And in addition to doing the CEO type stuff in terms of vision and strategy, I just kind of jump in and do whatever it takes. So I sometimes call myself the garbage man, even though we don't have an actual office, we're all remote. Take out the garbage, I brew coffee, get people what they need, and then help support our clients is my main goal.
Thanks, Randy. Appreciate that. Yeah, and happy birthday, Lucas. Hope we didn't have any security breach because of that. No, it's joking. But yeah, happy birthday, and thanks for spending time with us on your birthday. We feel honored. So awesome. Let's jump right into some topics. Lucas, I'd love for you to kind of open us up and kind of set the stage for really why this topic is important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important because as many of the folks I know on today know that ultimately the board is the one responsible for the cybersecurity program. And they can delegate some of, some of the responsibilities, but ultimately it all rolls up to, and that board is responsible for the cyber program. So it's critical they fully understand what's going on with it, the status of the cybersecurity program, where things are at, so that they're able to make solid, sound decisions for the organization that really aligns with the business goals and where they want to go. And so I think that's one of the key pieces. And as I kind of mentioned, over the last 15 years, Randy, myself, we've reviewed, provided feedback, created hundreds, if not thousands, of board reports for banks and credit unions. And so we really have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I think we're going to touch on that today as far as what works, what doesn't, and kind of what we've seen. And just kind of high level, one of the number one issues we see is when board reports are filled with too much technical information or really anything the board doesn't fully understand. If they're overwhelmed, they might just kind of gloss over some of the cybersecurity pieces. Which leads to that lack of understanding, which it causes a lack of confidence and realistically can lead to a lack of resources for the cybersecurity team. And so as we go through the discussion today, hopefully we can answer some questions you guys have and then just provide some guidance on what we've seen throughout all the different board reports we've created, the reporting we've done, and just provide you with at least one nugget or a couple takeaways that you can use to improve your board reporting process, or at least review it and go, hey, I'm doing a great job, and give you confidence in what you have today.
Thanks, Lucas. Super helpful context. Appreciate that. And I also just realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Taylor Wells. I'm the head of marketing. I've been working at Rivial for the past couple of years. So if you're wondering who I am, I'm not just some random person. Looking forward to today's discussion. Awesome. Thanks for that context, Lucas. Super helpful. And I'd love to kind of jump into the next question here. And folks, I know a bunch of folks just joined. Please throw your questions in the chat or the Q&A area. Love to make this interactive. I know we have at least 50 plus folks already here. Please throw in your questions. First question for you, Randy, is how do I know what to report to the board?
It was a medical doctor who was in charge of hospital administration. So I don't know specifically how that works, but he was a doctor and then he was in some kind of administrative role, basically in charge of the hospital, at the regional hospital. I was at a large bank one time and I met a board member who was a C-level executive at an insurance company, right? So very, very different backgrounds. right? So hopefully, you presenting to the board, you have the opportunity to meet those people, talk to them a little bit, perhaps, or maybe just send a report off. It could be either way, but you can always figure out who they are and look at their backgrounds to know who you're presenting to. And as Lucas mentioned, these are not technical people usually. Right? There's no requirement to be a technical person to be on a board. There was some talk of that, making sure you have a cybersecurity person, but the majority of the people looking at what you're reporting, usually not technical, usually not thinking about security like we are day in and day out. Think about the audience, and then consider that the goal of the board meeting or meetings, the goals are to make decisions, right? So when you're reporting, think about that part, right? So you need to present kind of in general the status of your security program so they know what's going on. Any efforts or initiatives you have in progress to reduce risk, right? So they know what's there, what's going to be there, and then any approvals needed, right? Kind of wrap all that stuff up. And so applying what you know about the audience to these areas will really help you in terms of deciding what to report. And we'll get into some more of those details. And then I would also suggest adjusting over time, because the biggest indicator, if you're presenting the wrong stuff, if you put forward a decision or recommendation and there's a decision to be made by the board and you don't get any questions, that is not a good sign. That doesn't mean you did such a good job reporting that they they don't have any questions. If you're asking them to make a decision and they don't have questions, that is, I would say 99% of the time, a bad thing. You want them to ask questions because that means they're engaged, they understand what you're asking them, and they're trying to get more information to make a better decision.
Interesting. Thank you, Randy. Appreciate you sharing that. Lucas, let's go on to the next question here is how long should my board report be and how frequently do you recommend reporting to the board?
Yeah. That's a great question. And we see it very different. Randy even alluded to that a little bit as far as you might not even get to report to them. You might just send off a report and not get to present it or have that discussion. But hopefully you do. Honestly, the shorter the better without leaving anything out is my kind of high level recommendation. You don't want to inundate them with tons and tons and tons of information that they go, well, not going to read that, or that'll put me to sleep, and move on. And we've seen that. I've seen 50 plus, I think even 100 plus potentially page board reports. And those just don't get read. They're not going to read them. They want the high level, the synopsis, the thing to make decisions off of, as Randy mentioned. So I've seen a good sweet spot to pick an actual number, anywhere between 3 and 10 pages. You can usually, in that length, get across the key information they need. Now, there's times that might be a little longer, times it might be shorter. You can do a 1-page update, but usually 3 to 10 is just kind of on average where I've seen the sweet spot, as far as it's enough information to give them a very clear picture, focus on the key items that they need to see to make decisions off of, but not overwhelm them with information, inundate them, and go, okay, help them still understand it. And then as far as frequency goes, ideally it's monthly. I know we've seen all sorts of shapes and sizes, but some ideally if you can do it monthly. Some are annual, some are quarterly, some are every other month we've seen. And I know that's generally not up to the folks we're meeting with, but if you can push for an ideally at least quarterly and ideally monthly, get some type of status report or update to the board. I really do think that's critical.
Thanks, Lucas. Appreciate that. We got our first question from the audience as well, which I'd love to answer here. And the question is, I face an ongoing challenge in producing content that is valuable and appropriate for the board while also satisfying auditor requirements. Board level reporting is intended for a non-technical audience and should remain concise and risk focused, while auditors, NCUA, and internal audit often expect significantly more detailed and technical information than is suitable for inclusion in such reports. And I know we'll talk about auditors here in a little bit, but any thoughts, Lucas or Randy, on that?
Yeah, I could jump in and provide maybe an overly simplistic response. This may or may not work depending on the structure of your reporting and what the examiner is actually asking for. But I would say if you can basically break it into 2 parts, the stuff you want to report to them and you should report to them, and then additional details. Okay, so kind of like an executive summary, that's for the board, that's what you want them to see. And then if you mark the rest, right, not as, don't mark it as my examiner told me to report this, but additional details, technical details, whatever you call it, if the board sees what you want them to see, right, the important stuff, and then you have those additional details below that, they might skim through them, but at least they have a chance to see what you want them to see, right, the good stuff to report. And then again, unfortunately, auditors and examiners, they're people too. They don't know everything. I'm not picking on examiners right now, but if there are certain things they want, there might be a reason for that. Sticking in those technical details, it's there. Realistically, you're meeting that requirement, but you're still reporting to the board above the line, if you will, what you want them to see, and how you're going to help them make their decisions is above that line, above the fold, so to speak.
Very cool. Thank you, Randy. Appreciate that. I got another question from James here. I feel I have to train my board. They get monthly reports and they only ask me to give a brief one pager. How do I guide the board to the information they should be receiving instead of a brief overview of IT projects?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think board training is super important. And so I think it's actually a great idea. And it's something I know the NCUA specifically this year was harping on a lot, that they were requiring boards to get cybersecurity training. And the natural follow up questions to that we got a lot was, well, what should we train our board on? What are they going to want? What does the NCUA want us to train our board on? And I think it's crucial to do a periodic, if not even once a year, a board training on cybersecurity and focusing that heavily on what you're going to be reporting to the board. If you have a standard board report, it sounds like, yeah, your goal is to shift that a bit to a new format and focusing on some key information. I think presenting that in a training, here's kind of the why, it's aligning with examiner expectations. Here's why we're moving to this new format. I think it's a great idea. We've seen that go really well. Just kind of a quick side note story. We have a client who they'd switched to a new risk model, and they were presenting risk to the board in a new way they weren't before. And before they did that, though, and presented that, they wanted to do a training. And so I went on site and it was a 45-minute training, which is honestly rare. You get that much time with the board, especially for training. But we walked through the whole risk model, what's included, what they should be looking for, the types of questions they should be asking, what the red flags should be. And the response was great. The board members were super grateful. They asked fantastic questions. And I think since then, any future board reports with that information, the board has been much more engaged. So I think it's a great idea to kind of, if you're able to train the board, just so they're understanding what you're presenting better. And then, you can kind of through that training provide a new format, what you'll be presenting and really sharing the why with them, that it's really for them, that you want to kind of shift what you're presenting.
Thanks, Lucas. Great question. We got another question. Lena asked, just to add to James' question, how do you balance brevity with strategic depth when reporting to the board that prefers one pagers? Any more context or color?
Yeah, I can jump in here too. Yeah, that's a tough one. Because what the one pager I think is okay if you are presenting the right information, and we'll get into that with some additional questions. The part about James's question that I think it was James that caught me was they just want to hear about IT projects. That speaks to me. Lucas talked about training, and James mentioned training. That speaks to me of just not really understanding the full picture. So the question, of course, is how do you get from point A, where they just want IT projects, that's all they get, that's all they understand currently, to understanding the full picture. If it were me, I'd find a place in that one pager to start sneaking in a regular risk component, something meaningful, like maybe it's just one initiative and a recommendation and a return on investment number, or the highest risk in the organization and what that dollar exposure is, right? Something that has meaning, that can just take a little place on that one pager, right? So they, if nothing else, they see it a couple of times, and hopefully somebody eventually asks a question like, what the heck is that? What does that mean? How do we fix that, or something? Obviously, if you put that in there and they tell you to take it out, then you're relying on that training and going back to what Lucas said. But if it were me, I'd sneak in something meaningful that makes sense to them. Just, the language of business, dollars and return on investment. See where it gets you.
Thanks, Randy. That's great. We got some more questions coming in, and please keep throwing them in the chat or the Q&A. We'd love to bring those up. I do, since you hinted on that, on including some stuff around risk, Randy, I'd love for you to kind of talk a little bit more about when you walk into a board meeting, what are those 3 to 5 core cyber metrics or visuals you'd recommend showing every time, and why those over all the others you could report on? I think those are kind of connected with what we're talking about.
Yeah, that was a great segue. So thank you to those who asked those questions. So yeah, 3 to 5 metrics. I would start just understanding, again, back to the audience. We're in the weeds every day. We can look at security metrics and know the importance of them. We know what they mean. Board, generally speaking, probably won't, right? So just referring back to the audience, I would start with a kind of a small, repeatable set of visuals that can fit on one page. Or maybe you can squeeze the IT projects that James has to report on, and then the other half of the page are these 3 to 5 metrics. And so the types of metrics I would put in there: number one, I'd put in top cyber risks in dollars. I realize that's a big jump if you're currently reporting or measuring risk in high, medium, and low. Totally get it. But I always recommend, I have for years, I recommend quantification. It seems intimidating. It's not that hard. I'd be happy to help you with it. But something like a bar chart, for example, with the top 5 cybersecurity risk scenarios expressed in dollar exposure. And so what that answers for the board is what could hurt us most. That's what they should be asking the questions about. And in a sense, when you put that in there, you're training them on what they should be thinking about. Number 2, I would put in risk as measured versus appetite. And so your risk appetite is that line in the sand that you draw that says if the risk goes above this line, we have to do something about it. And that should be the board or a subset of the board establishing that appetite. So if they establish the appetite, or they say this is the amount of risk that we will accept as an entity, and then you go measure risk and you come back and say, hey, you said you'd only accept this and we measured risk above that. We need to do something about it. Again, back to the decision making, right? You draw the line in the sand, risk goes over that. They need to do something about it. So some, 2 metrics. The third, I would say, probably risk over time, which could be a line chart, that hopefully shows your risk going down. Right. If your rapport with the board is good, you're reporting the correct things, you're making recommendations, they're making decisions that over time gets that risk to go down to an acceptable level. And I could get crazy. I'll maybe add a couple more metrics. So I would say not just from a risk perspective, maybe also report on control maturity. And I'm not talking compliance. Maturity is slightly different than compliance. Compliance is either on, off, yes, no, it's in place or it's not in place. Maturity is more about how well you're doing it. So I would report on control maturity for some key controls, right? You don't want a whole page of controls, but those key controls that are important, and tying that back to the risk assessment. I would also include some, just an overall compliance piece as well. So I think I'm up to 5. So I'll throw in one more. I would put in, if there's space, if you can, a roadmap with quantified risk reduction. Right. So what you're telling the board there is if we, here are my recommendations as your security person. I know what your appetite is. I've measured risk. If it's above appetite, we put these things in place. Here's how much our risk is going to reduce. Here's the return on investment. Seeing that, even if you just have to squish it into a small corner or 1-pager, right? Seeing that kind of information should get somebody, whether it's a farmer or a medical doctor or a C-level executive at an insurance company, to look at that and go, what is that? Do I need to make a decision on that? That looks important, right? So that's what I think I was up to maybe 5 or 6 metrics there, but that's what I would focus on to prompt the questions and try to point the board in the direction they need to go, which is making decisions about risk, right? Going back to what Lucas first said on this call.
Thanks, Randy. And looks like we got some more questions we'll address here in a second. I actually have a question, which either one of you, if you wouldn't mind humoring me, I'm curious, especially Randy and or Lucas. We've obviously worked with hundreds of banks and credit unions and been involved in a lot of board meetings and board reports. When organizations have adopted some of those metrics, what has changed in that organization? How has the relationship with the security leader and the board have changed? Yeah, especially for that relationship, or what are some just some case studies that in your own experience that you, oh wow, this is how it's changed. This is how my relationship with the board has changed, my job security, et cetera. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I can start. It's a lot more questions. Randy, I think, started his first answer with, if they're silent, that might not be a good thing. You want them to ask questions, you want them to engage. And that's the first thing we've seen and noticed, which builds a relationship, right? When you have more back and forth, when you ask questions, get to know each other, dive deeper on a topic, just in general, that builds a stronger, better relationship. And that's what we've seen as far as, even Randy in his last answer, go, oh, what is that? And that's usually where it starts, is there's something in there they don't understand, but it's, whether it might be a big number. A lot of times it might be something like, hey, $6 million of risk. They go, that's a big number. What does that mean? I don't like that. And then you can dive into it. Well, we measured risk here. Here's what we found. Here's what we're recommending to reduce. And that really just starts to build the relationship, which builds trust. And so I don't know about job security per se. I don't have any case studies there, but I have seen a lot of great, a lot more questions start being asked and a lot more trust built between the security person and the board, and just more understanding there as well. So,
thank you. Cool. Let's jump into another question. Amit asks, do you see value in having different types of reports? For example, a lighter monthly report than a larger annual report? Any thoughts on different types of reports, frequency?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll start. Lucas might see this differently. We've not really ever talked about this like on the call, so our thoughts might not be in alignment. It happens. And I generally lean toward consistency. But, perhaps this is an opportunity to tie in some of the earlier questions where if the examiner is making you report a bunch of technical stuff, if it's only once a year, which is a general examiner recommendation, well, at least it used to be. Hopefully this, and that probably still applies to some people. If it's an annual thing, maybe provide just the executive summary every month or every quarter, and then include those technical details every year. Right? Because I generally go for consistency because, again, it's kind of like if you think about driving a car, this is the first thing that popped in my mind. So it's a weird analogy. When you get into your car, imagine if the dashboard was different every time you got into the car. You're trying to cruise down the road, you're looking for the speedometer, you don't know where it's at. Oh, you find it over here, or maybe it looks different, maybe it's digital, maybe it's analog. So I do the same thing as your board report. To some extent, it should function like a dashboard, right? So you have, the status of your program, the things you need to do, those kinds of things, right? It should look very similar. So I wouldn't change the annual report drastically. I would try to be consistent. And again, if you can maybe throw in the technical details at the bottom of the report, do that annually. Put in those annual things to make it a larger report, but keep that monthly, those key metrics and those important things that you want them to see every month or every quarter, keep those at the top.
I agree completely on that one. That was going to be my response was keeping it the same, but I think your appendix analogy, your appendix kind of example you used earlier, adding those in, I think that's perfect.
We have alignment. Perfect. We can move on. Okay, the next question is for Lucas, and we may have already answered a bit of this, but if there's any additional insight, Lucas, I'd love to hear. How do you ensure you align with FDIC or NCUA requirements on board reporting while presenting the most relevant information for the board? Any additional? I know Randy kind of touched on a bit of that earlier, but any additional insights?
Yeah, no, I think we've covered it for the most part. I touched on earlier, it has been a big focus area. I think examiners and regulatory bodies are wanting to get the board more involved because it is important, like we talked about, them being responsible for it. Training, I think, is very important for the board. I know we touched on that piece. Most organizations we work with, so NCUA, they're using the NCUA ISE controls to examine all credit unions. FDIC uses the Intrex and to examine a lot of the banks. Your state regulators, they have a specific set of controls. They're usually leveraging one of those two, or they're looking at what you decide to align with internally. And so I think ensuring that if you're reporting on those key metrics, the board should be seeing a lot of those items, that Randy talked through and mentioned. I would start there. And then I would just validate your board report covers any of the items laid out in that. So if you're a credit union, go back to the NCUA ICE statements, look at what the NCUA is going to be looking at, and just go through all the items on board reporting. Did I include this? Is this included in my metrics? And then looking at those and making a decision, is this critical enough that it should really be highlighted in that summary or the above the fold piece that Randy talked through? Or is it something I can kind of add as an appendix once a year or kind of an add-on to the report in the details section to make sure I meet the regulator requirements, but keep the board focused on what's most important? So that's kind of how I would balance that. And I know we kind of hit on it a few different times so far today already.
Thanks, Lucas. That's awesome. Yeah, folks have other questions, feel free to put in the chat, the Q&A. And we'd love to answer them. Lucas, this is another follow-up question. Randy mentioned putting more quantitative metrics in the board report. The question is, boards often hear about high, medium, and low risk. Why is that no longer enough? And what does a more quantitative approach to cyber risk reporting look like in practice?
Yeah. It's a great question. I'll take a first stab at it. Randy's really our risk expert, our resident risk nerd, so I might pass some of this to him. But what we've seen, especially with high, medium, and low, is that it's very subjective, right? High to me or medium to me might be very different than what's medium risk to you, Taylor, or medium risk to Randy. And so everyone's definition is different of a high, medium, and low. So someone might see medium and go, oh, cool. Medium, that's good. We're fine. Someone might be medium and go, well, that's getting a little risky for my taste. And so it's hard to align everyone on high, medium, and low, especially when I see, a lot of times there's a risk tolerance. It's like, oh, we're cyber risk is low. We have a low tolerance for cyber risk. Well, what does that mean? And they measured it, the team did, and they said, yep, we're low cyber risk. We're good to go. And sometimes it's hard to go, okay, what does that mean truly? And that's where we see a lack of questions because people go, well, we're low. We said we'd be low. I think we're low, we're good. And they move on. And so by leveraging quantitative numbers and financial values, as Randy mentioned, is something everyone understands. $1,000 to me is $1,000 to you. How it affects each bank or credit union will be different. Some banks or credit unions are much larger, some are smaller. And so the scale will shift, but everyone understands it. The farmer understands $1,000, the C-level insurance person, the doctor, everyone can understand and relate back to money. And then everything else that the rest of the team is reporting, the different departments are reporting up to the board. I think Don mentioned how much information, they're getting is all generally in financial values, what the ROI is, what the cost of something is, what the return on that is, and how it aligns with the strategic goals of the organization. And so by measuring risk quantitatively, it just adds so much more value than high, medium, and low. If there are non-technical folks on the board, they can understand those metrics so much better. So it just helps with an understanding. It helps with questions they ask, and ultimately helps with the decision making that we're looking for.
Any additional insights, Randy, as the resident risk nerd?
Yeah, only to throw in a cheesy analogy, I stick with the automobile. I mean, if you imagine that you drove down the road and all of the speed limit signs were in low, medium, high, interpreting that into speed, you'd have like slow, moderate, fast. If you're 80, 30 probably feels pretty fast. If you're 20 in a sports car, that probably feels pretty slow. So to me, and this is an analogy I just made up on the spot, by the way, I might stick with it. It's feeling pretty good. But to me, if you're driving around speed limits, say slow, moderate, fast, that's kind of like what it is when you go into the board and say, hey, we need $50,000 to go from red to orange. Right? There's really no intrinsic meaning there. And so you're asking for real dollars and not providing any real justification for why you need those dollars other than intuition, which might be right on, but other than intuition and, vendor marketing materials. Right. So yeah, I could go on, but I won't. I have to temper my thoughts on risk because I could talk for hours. I don't want to do that to you folks.
Very cool. Well, I do have another follow-up question, Randy, so you can continue talking a bit about risk. And let's talk about kind of the how. So if financial institutions wants to start expressing cyber risk in dollar terms, what data do they actually need to collect, and how do you turn that into a meaningful risk number?
Sure. And I think I can keep this fairly short. And once again, I love this stuff. And if you look at my LinkedIn profile, I get a little playful with it. I think I call myself the world's largest cyber risk geek or something. And part of that's just because it's fun, but also part of that's because I think it might be true. I've never met a human who has done more and thought more and is as passionate about cyber risk as I am. So I think I've earned that title. Maybe not. If you're out there, let me know. We can go have a beer and talk about it. And so I'll try and keep this fairly straightforward without totally hijacking the meeting. But if you think about kind of a notional formula of risk, it's impact times likelihood, or I tend to say probability because that it seems a little more precise to me. So impact times probability. So if you break down what the impact part of that equation is, that really, at a very high level, is information systems that are rated for availability. That's important because if you think about downtime for your core processing system versus a branch kiosk, that impact to the organization is very, very different. And so that's kind of the first part of impact. The second part of impact is what we call data types. This would be your information assets, or just the types of information that are on each system, being stored or transmitted by each system. And the way we do it at Rivial is we rate the data types for confidentiality and integrity. Because if you think about it, regardless of where, let's say you have customer or member information that gets compromised, it doesn't matter where it came from. It's the fact that it got compromised, so your legal fees, your credit report monitoring fees, all of those fees, your cleanup fees, those are all going to be the same, right? So if you put those two together, the information systems and the data types, that's your CIA ratings. We have included one other one, a new one for artificial intelligence. That's a whole different story. But just to keep it simple, CIA ratings for information systems and data types, that gives you the impact, right? So we're halfway there to that notional formula. The other data points that you need to grab revolve around the probability or likelihood. And that really is the risks, right? Those are the bad things that can happen to a system, to your organization. And those are going to come with inherent probability ratings. And so if you have a list of bad things that can happen, and we use a list of about 20, we call them key risk indicators for many reasons. But if you have those, you can go out, you can look at the Verizon Data Breach Report, multiple studies that are out there, and really get a feel for how likely, just without any controls in place, how likely are each of these bad things to happen? Or what's the probability of these things happening? The second component of probability is looking at controls. Right? So you have controls, each one has its own strength rating, and each one has its implementation rating, right back to the maturity of controls, right? How well have you implemented it? So for the most part, controls reduce probability, right? In some cases, they can reduce impact, but for the most part, it's around probability. So if you look at the two parts of that equation, impact and probability, you have information systems, data types that get you the impact, and you have risks and controls that get you the likelihood or probability, right? So the risks with inherent probability, controls give you the residual probability. You take all those things and then you turn those into your risk numbers, right? So it's in a very simplified sense, gathering those four data inputs, and then you're off to the races with being able to quantify risk.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's go to the next question. Lucas, my management team and board is against reporting cyber security and risk and financial values to the board. How do I get buy-in, understanding, and help shift the culture? So we've talked a lot about earlier about kind of the why. Randy just took us through kind of what the material aspect would be. But let's say there's pushback. Let's say they're and I know we've experienced that with some organizations where they don't want the change. So how do we
Yeah.
create that new culture?
Yeah, that's a good question because it's a tough one. We actually, I've seen it more than I expected to. A handful of times a year when talking just to folks at conferences and stuff, it comes up. And I think a lot of people are scared to change. They're used to what they're used to seeing. Randy used his dashboard analogy earlier that seeing a new one can be scary for some folks. And I think the biggest piece is this is where the training really comes in to help understand the why. And maybe it starts, Randy discussed earlier, slipping in a number or two to kind of help maybe start the questions from the board. But in an ideal world, it would start with training and overview of why you're moving to a new format and then explaining that new format so that they understand it. Because the biggest pushback is, well, how do we know we can trust these numbers? Where did these numbers come from? I would say are probably two of the most common questions when a board is moving to seeing quantitative risk numbers for the first time. And so if you can provide them a training explaining the methodology, explaining the using of breach data, all the different where you're getting these data points, and so that they can trust and feel confident in the numbers, that will really help shift it. And I've not once seen a board who's gone through training, got walked through the model, looked at, okay, where are these coming from? How are we getting these numbers? And that went, nope, yeah, we still don't want financial value. So, let's go back to the way we were doing it. And so with anything, I think helping them understand the why, providing that training to make sure they understand where the numbers are coming from, what they mean. So again, to reduce that confusion, to reduce the unknown, and that a lot of people fear with that comes with change. And I'd actually like to see if Randy has any other thoughts on this one as well, because admittedly, I wrote out some of these questions for us, and I was really hoping he was going to take this one. So I would love to hear any of Randy's thoughts on this one also.
Well, you caught me. I was looking ahead at my next question and what I was going to say there. So no, I don't have any useful to add. Very sorry.
No.
Well, good. We'll give you 21 minutes to think of a response before the webinar is over. No, just joking. I do got a question from Philip here, and I think he was tying off of what Randy was sharing in regards to how to gather the data, et cetera. He asked, to continue the discussion, how would you recommend cyber info security coordinate with accounting and data teams to get access to ERP data for purpose of quantify risk? Would you recommend the cyber info security team bring its own data to the data teams to integrate with the ERP? Or would you recommend the cybersecurity teams get access to the data for the purpose of developing their own quantification reporting?
Boy, that's a hard one for me to envision what they would be what this person is looking for or thinking about looking for in the data, right? So an ERP system, I think employees. That's one thing that comes to mind for me. Enterprise resource planning is how I know it. Which one of those things is employees? That to me is really around cost of controls. Because typically, if you go to buy a security tool, it might be based, the cost might be based on amount of traffic over the network. It might be based on amount of users actually getting into using the tool, whatever it is. It might be based on users, right? If you have, a number of employees in your organization. So when I heard that question, those are the kinds of things I think about in terms of bringing the data over into risk quantification. So if that is the case, and if I'm understanding the question correctly, I wouldn't try to create my own. I would just try to get that information periodically. Maybe it's once a quarter, maybe it's once a year, from the people that own that data. And the reason I say that, just sort of in general, is I'm a firm believer in a single source of truth. So if you have, let's say you have your ERP system that has employees, and to simplify it, you're just looking for a number of employees. If it's 1,000 this month, you don't want to copy that over and put it in your spreadsheet because now you have two versions of that same information, and it could be 1,200 next year, and you still have 1,000 in your spreadsheet. Maybe it doesn't get updated, right? So just trying to maintain that single source of truth and just know where that number comes from, ERP or some other system, bring that over. And if it almost sounds like there might be a problem coordinating among different departments. I think if that is the case, I might be making assumptions and reading too much between the lines here. But if that is the case, then it comes back to training not only the board, but the organization about how you should be managing risk and making decisions and being able to get that access. And maybe it's not even access per se, but just the number. Or you might just need, somebody go in, tell me what the number of employees is. 'Cause, I know it's a simple example. Somebody knows that, but those kinds of data points that you need to bring into your risk assessment and your risk management program, I would recommend getting those rather than creating your own or trying to store those somewhere else.
And the other thing I'd add to that, and just kind of expand upon it more in general as well, that I think is really important is, that was one specific example, the ERP resources, gathering certain information from that, is that risk assessment definitely shouldn't be done in a silo as well, as far as just us, the security person, going and doing that risk assessment and presenting it. You definitely want to engage really those subject matter experts. If you're looking and risk assessing a lending system from a cybersecurity perspective, what types of data, how much data, and including the person that oversees that lending system to make sure you're getting accurate information, as you're looking at controls for that lending system. And in this example, they know that system better than anyone. And so making sure you're engaging the different departments and different resources to gather that information as well, rather than doing risk assessment in a silo, which we sometimes see also.
Thank you both. That's great. We got another 15 minutes here or so, folks. So if you have any last minute questions, please put them in the chat. We got a couple more here on our agenda we'll go through. Randy, this question is for you. How many directors, many directors asked, are we spending the right amount on cybersecurity? How can CISOs and risk leaders frame cybersecurity as an investment with measurable ROI rather than just a cost center?
Certainly. My initial response, my short version is speak their language. And so if anybody on the call has not gone out and actually looked at a board report or a board packet, I would highly recommend it. I mean, they're huge. Number one, it's a tremendous amount of information, even at smaller credit unions or smaller banks. Obviously the size and the larger banks have bigger packets, but there's a lot of information, a lot of pages, a lot of data, and the vast majority of it, if it's not in a table, spelled out directly in a table, it gets summarized as ones and zeros. Well, not ones and zeros like a computer, but sorry, went way off track there. Dollars and cents and return on investment and things like loan to value ratios and asset liability ratios, all of those things, it's all dollars and cents and some ratios. So considering that, the board might meet monthly, they might meet quarterly, back to the farmer, he's on his tractor or his combine, or whatever tool he's using at the time. He's not thinking about cybersecurity. So he shows up monthly, quarterly, whatever the cadence is. And he gets this big giant packet full of dollars and cents and ratios. And then there's a little piece of that packet that's high, medium, low, CVEs, IP addresses, all these things that, it sticks out like a sore thumb. And so I think the key, kind of back to that quantification process, is to talk about risk in terms of risk reduction per dollar, right? If we spend $1, we're going to reduce risk by this much. And I will say I speak regularly about the problem with ordinal scales. And I can't stress that enough. If you're reporting cybersecurity risk in high, medium, low, or red, orange, green, or whatever, and you have your heat map, the dreaded heat map, you're not actually reporting cybersecurity in a way that makes sense to business people and to the board of directors. Right. And I will tell you a quick story. Lucas knows this firsthand. When we first implemented our software and we started generating reports showing financial quantitative results, the people getting those reports, mostly boards, they went, "Oh my gosh, where's my stoplight report?" Because we're going back to what Lucas said, it was change, right? So at some point, I think to this day, our reports still have some kind of coloring in. Our software has it in there because people are just so used to seeing these colors. Quick side note, I think it's the bane of our existence as security people, measuring risk in high, medium, low, or some kind of ordinal scale. I think that's why we're a cost center. We're the bad guys in some cases, right? We don't get the respect. We don't get a seat at the big table because we're not speaking the right language. So that's why our reports, it was so different reporting quantitatively. We had to put the stoplights in there. And so people see the stoplights and go, okay, I'm used to that. I know what I'm seeing here. They don't ask any questions. We move on to this next section and it has the quantification and they go, oh, well, tell me about this. Tell me about that, right? Because it actually means something to them, right? So when we put that red, I was going to say red, white, blue. I'm all over the place. I got my red, white, and blue jacket on, looking at myself here. When we put on our stoplights, they don't care. It doesn't mean anything. But when they get to the actual quantification values that our software produces, that's when I start asking questions. It has meaning, and they go, "Oh, let's have a conversation about this." And so, in terms of measuring risk and risk reduced in dollars and cents, that allows a pretty simple ROI formula, right? ROI is not hard to calculate. It's gain divided by cost times 100. So if you're asking for something and you put the numbers into your spreadsheet or our software, whatever you have, and the risk reduction or the gain is $2 million, and the cost is, let's say, $500,000. It's a very expensive project. That's 4 and times it by 100, that's 400. So your ROI on that project is 400%, which is ridiculously huge in terms of what most banks and credit unions are looking at. But that's real, right? You've measured the risk. You can reduce it with a particular initiative, and you can measure that and say, here, I'm asking for this amount of money. Here's the ROI. Here's the dollar exposure that we're reducing. And so if I could put in a little plug, right, a platform like ours, right, the Rivial software, right, it makes that visible at the initiative level so you can show ROI on your security initiatives and help the board make those decisions.
Thanks, Randy. Appreciate that. Awesome. We got a couple more questions to let it cover. If you have any more, folks, looks like Lindsay asked about the platform, and Randy answered some of the questions as far as the board reporting. And Albert, this will be recorded. Asked if we can get a recording of the platform. We're happy to schedule a meeting with you to kind of show you the platform. And yeah, we'll send out the information after the webinar. Let's talk, Lucas. Next question here is: our board often wants to know how we can compare to our peers. What's the best approach to showing or handling this question?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, admittedly. We're lucky in the sense that we work with a lot of organizations of different sizes. And so we can compare, certain metrics in certain ways and just share some qualitative and quantitative data across those. But without that reference point for others, I would handle it in the sense of looking at industry averages as a starting point, but really comparing back to yourself. Randy talked earlier about risk tolerance and how do we compare to our own risk tolerance. And so looking at the size of the organization and the goals of the organization when setting that risk tolerance. And kind of going back, that was another big focus for examiners this year, was ensuring the board understands risk tolerance and is part of setting and approving that. And so if you have board buy-in on a risk tolerance, they already, they're looking at everything else across the financial institution. They know the goals of the organization, which are different for everyone. We work with organizations that are high growth. They are trying to open a lot of new branches, expand into new products, and all of that. We work with some who are kind of just more status quo. We just kind of want to maintain. And depending on that for your organization, your risk tolerance is going to be significantly different, and how much they're going to want to spend on security is going to be significantly different. And so everyone wants to know, how do we compare to others? It's a tricky question because everyone has different goals. And so I would point your board in the direction of focusing on tying the risk tolerance that you're setting with them back to their current goals. So again, buying into, here's, as a credit union or a bank, our strategic goals for the year. Based on that, we together set this risk tolerance, and here's how we compare to our own risk tolerance and how that aligns with our goals. So I know it's kind of answering the question by changing the focus, but I really do think that is the best way to focus on how much you should be spending, what is our current risk? Is that an acceptable level of risk? By comparing it back to your own organization and what the goals of it are. Hopefully that helps. I know it's kind of a non-answer by tweaking a little bit. And Randy, I don't know if you had other thoughts, but that would kind of be my recommendation there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great answer. And I vote yes, thumbs up that one, because even though it doesn't really answer how do you compare to your peers, I think it answers the question properly. And I get there's kind of that mentality where, we just want to do what our peers are doing, right? We don't have to run faster than the bear. We just have to run faster than the person next to us. I understand that emotional need for that. But when you start comparing your risk specifically to your peers, I think that's when you get in trouble for exactly those reasons, right? Your risk appetite, or your organization's risk appetite could be very different than your peer, right? You look for asset size organizations in the same asset size, and those are your peers. They might have very different strategic plans, strategic objectives and initiatives. So I would steer away from comparing to peers. And if you give that response to your board and it's still not good enough, we can probably help. I just wouldn't start with that.
Yeah,
Right.
and just to give kind of a quantitative example of that, we work with organizations that are like two credit unions, say, that are same asset size, same number of employees, that their risk tolerance is multi-million dollars apart. Like it can, different probability levels, multi-million dollars apart, different just based on their goals, based on their tolerance for risk and what they're trying to do. And so usually based on asset or employees, it's kind of in a similar ballpark, but there's times it is very different of organizations, the exact same type and size, just based on what they're focused on and what they're doing.
Thank you both. That's great. Awesome. We got a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up here. Randy, what are and you've mentioned some of these already, but what are the common mistakes you see when people report cybersecurity to the board, especially around metrics and dashboards? And how would you recommend fixing them?
Sure, absolutely. From an overall perspective, and I know we only have a few minutes. I'll try and keep this fairly short. But from an overall perspective, I think it's looking at security from the wrong perspective. You should be looking at it not from your perspective where you're in it every day, as I mentioned earlier, but from the board's perspective. They're in it, maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes a quarter. Mistake number one that we see quite often still today is just making it too technical, as Lucas mentioned earlier, right? Putting in CVEs, antivirus alerts, right? When you start to put those things in, boards tune out. So obviously to fix that, translate everything you can to business impact, right? Impact on customers and members, operations, again, dollars and cents, and then obviously regulatory outcomes, because that's what we all care ultimately. I think mistake number two kind of goes along with that, but vanity metrics, right? I've seen these forever in board reports. I still see them. I still try and talk people into taking them out, right? Saying that you blocked 10 million taps or 99% of your logs have been ingested into the SIM or, what have you, right? Reporting those things might mean something to you, right? You know what that means. But board members, generally speaking, do not. Right? There's no real context there. Obviously, fixing that, of course, is focusing on the metrics that I mentioned earlier that change decisions. What are the top risks? What is the risk versus appetite? How are these security initiatives going to change those numbers? Right? Those kinds of things that boards can take in, process, make better decisions. And I'll just say maybe a third mistake that we see quite often is, going back to the continuity of reporting is kind of static one-off slide decks. But if you're reporting something different, right, because you're trying to squeeze everything in, and maybe you only get one page and you report quarterly, so you put 4 different reports out there on one per quarter. That's back to the dashboard example. I think just changing things up is not a good thing. I think you want to be consistent, show the trends, show the same, as long as they're the key metrics, right? You don't want to show, again, number of spam messages blocked or whatever. As long as they're useful metrics, show them over and over again, and only show the ones that will change the board's decision on something. So when they see it, they go, oh, I need to do something about that. We need to take action. I need to make a different decision, or something that causes them to take action, or at least think about something differently, is really what you want to try and report. All of the technical jargon and details and things that are important to us in the weeds in security, but important to the overall organization.
Thanks, Randy. I think we have time for one more question, and Matt threw it in here. What approaches have you seen work best for tying cybersecurity controls directly to measurable business impact? So the board conversations move beyond technical risk into true resilience planning.
Oh, that's a very good question. I can only think of a very simplistic answer, though, and that is putting dollars on them. Again, if you're thinking about those initiatives, maybe you need an upgraded firewall, or you need to implement multi-factor authentication, right? There's 2 ways come to mind. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. Number one is putting dollars and quantification to it so that it makes sense. You're comparing apples to apples with everything else the board has to decide on. But then I think taking those initiatives, tying those to risks, right? So an initiative is typically a new process or control or enhanced control. Tie that to the risk to say, multi-factor authentication reduces this risk, like the risk of unauthorized application access. Once you do that, those risks are then, of course, tied to your information systems, which are used by business process. And if you have business continuity tied in, you know what business processes use which information systems So that whole chain exists, and you can report on that in various ways. Right? But if you have that in place and you say we want to spend this amount of money, we're going to reduce this much risk, and here is what it impacts. Right? If we have unauthorized access in our core system, game over. I'm stealing a line from the late 70s or early 80s. Right? I think it was Bill Paxton in Aliens. Right? Game over, man. Game over. Yes, I feel horrible for using that line because we actually make fun of it in my household. But that's kind of where you're at. And if you can show that linkage, that again is going to mean something to the board and hopefully influence them to do something and make a decision, not just skip past your section of the report and move on to something else that means.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Lucas. And we're up on time here, folks. Thanks for everyone for participating. And great questions, great insight. I learned a bunch myself. If you're interested in meeting with us, I just threw our link in the chat. I'm happy to meet with you all and take you through some of our solutions and see if we can be helpful in your journey. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. We'll send out the recording afterwards. So if you want to rewatch it or share it with your team, appreciate you all for attending. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Taylor.
Thank you. See you guys.